Alright, hello, my name is Hannah Walendowski, and as you can see by the title slide, I'm going to be discussing the anatomy and the functionality of the glossopharyngeal cranial nerve. I didn't want to do my favorite brain part assignment on parts that are super overdone, like the amygdala or hippocampus and thalamus and whatnot, so I looked more into our notes and remembered the 12 cranial nerves toward the beginning of the semester, and I also remembered how my anatomy teacher in high school told me he had a certain mnemonic to remember the order of the cranial nerves, and I'm not completely sure why that stuck with me all these years, but it did, and so I looked more into it, and I'm here to talk about it today. To kick things off, what even is the glossopharyngeal nerve? It's the ninth of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and the cranial nerves are just nerves in the brain that lead directly from the brain to various parts of the head, neck, and trunk of the body. Some of the cranial nerves are involved in controlling muscles of the face, regulating glands, or in special senses like seeing, hearing, or in the glossopharyngeal's case, taste. And it also supplies to the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, tonsils, and pharynx. Just a quick touch on that. The portion of the tongue that the glossopharyngeal is responsible for are the different taste buds, but the tongue in general is just vital for speech and chewing and swallowing food, and salivation aids in the breakdown of food for nutrient absorption and digestion. Then the pharynx is your throat, and that aids in digestion as well, and it's a part of our respiratory system. And then tonsils help trap germs that we may breathe in that could potentially be harmful to us. So it kind of works as its own mini immune system. And there are so many functions that this nerve can do, and it even works in partnership with other cranial nerves, like the 10th cranial nerve, for instance, which is the vagus nerve. And I'll touch on specific functions later, but this nerve particularly can output information, being a sender, as my third PowerPoint says, as well as it can receive info from other parts of the body. And then the picture I have is just a posterior view of the brain, and it points to where the cranial nerve is located. In order to discuss the functions, I think it would be proper to talk about the anatomy of where the cranial nerve touches first and like what it passes through and other things that it can directly affect while it is traveling through the body. The glossopharyngeal nerve originates in the medulla oblongata of the brain, and it emerges from the anterior aspect of the medulla, moving to the side of the cranial fossa, and that is just where there's a depression in the cranial floor of the brain so that the nerve can go through it to be able to enter up into the cranium, and then it leaves the cranium from the jugular foramen, which is a passageway between the temporal bone and the occipital bone of the skull, and it's specific for cranial nerves. Now, that's when the tympanic nerve arises, and the tympanic nerve is a branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve that participates in the formation of the tympanic plexus and provides sensory innervation within the middle ear to the membrane of certain areas. And it has a mixed sensory and parasympathetic composition. And immediately outside of the jugular foramen are two ganglia bodies, which are just collection of nerve cells, and they're known as the superior and inferior ganglia, and they contain the cell bodies of the sensory fibers in the glossopharyngeal nerve. Then once we're outside of the cranium, the nerve goes down the neck next to the carotid artery and at the stylopharyngeus, which is a muscle in the head and neck. And then within that, there are several branches of the nerve that arise to provide motor innervation to the muscle. And then once the nerve enters the pharynx, it splits off into more branches, the lingual, tonsil, and pharyngeal branches. The lingual branch provides the back 1/3 of the tongue with general and taste sensation, and the tonsillar branch forms a network of nerves known as the tonsillar plexus, and this is what provides networking to the tonsils. Then the pharyngeal branch combines with fibers from the 10th cranial nerve, which is the vagus nerve, as I mentioned, to form the pharyngeal plexus, and that is what innervates the mucous membrane of the oral pharynx, which is the portion of the throat that lies between the soft palate and the hyoid bone. So essentially, if you were to open your mouth and went straight back, this is where that area would be. As the glossopharyngeal nerve is making its route through the pharynx to the cranium, it has several branching nerves that aid in its purpose. I already mentioned the three main branching nerves being the pharyngeal, tonsillar, and lingual branches, but a few more to mention are here. So skipping over the first 3 bullet points here, we're here to talk about the carotid branch. It branches into the neck region and then runs on top of the internal carotid artery, and it reaches a fork at the common carotid artery where the nerve divides, and then it innervates the carotid sinus and the carotid body. The actions of this nerve are sensory and aid in the participation of the regulation of blood pressure and forming the pathways of the cardiac reflex. Moving down to the tympanic nerve, in which we have mentioned a few times now, but this branch carries sensory and parasympathetic fibers to the tympanic cavity. These I've already mentioned, but just a little reminder, the branches and overall functions of the glossopharyngeal nerve are sensory, motor, and parasympathetic. And these are all the sensory processes of the nerve. Then the motor functions of the glossopharyngeal nerve innervate the stylopharyngeus muscle of the pharynx. And this shortens and widens the throat, and then it elevates the larynx during swallowing. So that's the flap that is able to cover the tube that goes to your lungs. And as far as the special sensory functions go, the glossopharyngeal nerve provides taste sensation to the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, which the glossopharyngeal nerve in general is that's what it innervates to begin with. And then all the processes in relation with this nerve in the tongue are all involved, like I said, with the back 1/3 of the tongue. Then this slide just shows all of the different branches of the nerve. As I mentioned, all of these down here toward the bottom are like the pharyngeal branch, the tonsillar branch, lingual nerve, etc. And up toward the top is like how I talked about the tympanic plexus and the tympanic nerve and everything like that. So just a little visual to be able to see how that nerve just is throughout the body, just because like I pointed out before, the picture with like the muscles looks very different than what this picture looks like. All right, so parasympathetically, the glossopharyngeal nerve innervates the parotid gland, and the parotid gland is a salivary gland, and it produces a saliva rich in enzymes. And then, as we already know, the area that the glossopharyngeal nerve is occupying aids much in our food breakdown and digestion, so the enzymes really help just break down the food so that we can get all the absorption that our body needs. Looking more into like what could happen if damage was done to the glossopharyngeal nerve was interesting. So if there is damage done to the nerve, this can result in loss of taste sensation to the back, again, 1/3 of the tongue, and it can affect swallowing. In order to assess if damage has actually happened to the nerve, a doctor tests the gag reflex, and the nerve provides sensory innervation to the oropharynx, and it carries information to the gag reflex. So if damage is done, then the gag reflex will be absent and it won't work, essentially. All right, and to wrap up my presentation, this is the saying that my teacher used to say, which is, "An old Olympus towering top, a Finn and German viewed some hops." And even though I hadn't had to learn in depth about the 12 cranial nerves, this project really helped me just kind of get an overall view of something that was quite interesting to me that, like I mentioned, for some odd reasons stuck with me. So it was super fun to be able to just learn more about this one in particular. I just kind of picked a random one, to be quite honest with you, and learning about it was super fun. Although it was kind of confusing, it was a lot of fun. And hopefully in one day I can remember these nerves more specifically because of this project.